December 1944. Europe had been at war for over 5 long, devastating years. Towns lay in ruins, roads were littered with burned-out vehicles, and millions of civilians struggled to survive amidst the wreckage of a continent consumed by conflict. To the west, the Allies had surged ashore at Normandy in June, broken through the beaches at terrible cost, and swept across France in a wave of momentum few thought possible. Paris had been liberated in August, and by the winter the Allied lines stretched deep into Belgium and Luxembourg. To the east, the Red Army hammered at the gates of Poland, threatening to push into Germany itself. Many soldiers on both sides believed the war might end soon. Allied commanders hoped their troops would be back home within months. American soldiers in foxholes wrote letters to their families with optimism, some daring to believe they might be celebrating Christmas, not in the mud of the Ardennes, but in the warmth of their homes. But wars have a way of defying expectations, and this war, perhaps the greatest and most destructive in human history, had one last cruel surprise waiting. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler, now 55 years old and increasingly isolated, refused to accept the inevitability of defeat. His empire was crumbling, his armies retreating, his allies abandoning him. Yet Hitler still clung to a vision of turning the tide. He became obsessed with one last great gamble, a blow so powerful it might shatter the Allied front, split their armies in two, and force the Western powers to negotiate. If he could buy time in the West, perhaps he could shift forces to the east, where the Soviet advance threatened Germany's very existence. The place chosen for this desperate gamble was the Ardennes, a region of dense forest, narrow roads, and rolling hills straddling Belgium and Luxembourg. To many Allied planners, the Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place too difficult for large armies to maneuver. It was used as a rest area for units recovering from the brutal battles of Normandy and the Siegfried Line. Thinly held by exhausted and inexperienced troops, the Ardennes seemed an unlikely location for a major German assault. And yet, this assumption was precisely what Hitler counted on. He believed that by striking here, in the dead of winter, under the cover of bad weather, Germany could achieve the element of total surprise. The result would be the last great German offensive of the Second World War. It would become a battle fought in snow and ice, where young men faced not only the fury of artillery and tanks, but also the merciless cold of one of the harshest winters in decades. For the Americans, it would be the bloodiest battle of the war. For the Germans, it would be a gamble that consumed their last reserves of men, tanks, and fuel. And for the world, it would be remembered as a test of endurance, courage, and survival against impossible odds. This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble, and the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. By the closing months of 1944, Germany was on the defensive everywhere. To the east, the Red Army had crushed Army Group Center during Operation Bagration, sweeping across Belarus and reaching the gates of Warsaw. To the south, the Allies had invaded Italy, slowly grinding their way up the peninsula despite fierce German resistance. And to the west, the Anglo-American armies had broken through Normandy, liberated Paris, and were pressing toward the Rhine River, the natural barrier that shielded Germany's heartland. The Reich was under siege from all sides. German factories were bombed daily, cities reduced to rubble by Allied air raids, and fuel supplies running desperately short. Morale was faltering, even among seasoned units. Yet Hitler refused to surrender. He still believed in the possibility of a miracle, a single blow that could divide his enemies, shift momentum, and perhaps even change the course of the war. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that Hitler conceived what he called Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The codename itself was deliberately misleading. To German officers who saw it, it suggested a defensive posture, as if the Wehrmacht were preparing to guard the Rhine River from invasion. In reality, it was the opposite, a massive offensive that aimed to strike at the very heart of the Allied armies. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. German forces would secretly assemble in the dense Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. At dawn on December 16th, they would smash through the thin American lines with a surprise armored assault. Once the front was broken, they would race westward, capturing vital road networks, crossing the Meuse River, and seizing the Belgian port city of Antwerp. Antwerp was the jewel of the plan. Since its capture by the Allies in September, the port had become one of their most important supply hubs. Fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements flowed through Antwerp to sustain the vast Allied armies pressing into Germany. If Hitler's forces could seize it, the Allied front would be split in two. The British and Canadians to the north would be cut off from the Americans to the south. And in the chaos, Hitler hoped, the fragile alliance between Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin might fracture. But this vision was fraught with problems. Germany no longer possessed the military strength it once did. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin, its manpower depleted by years of fighting on multiple fronts. Many of the divisions slated for the Ardennes offensive were understrength, filled with teenagers, older men, and hastily trained conscripts. Fuel was in such short supply that German commanders worried whether their tanks would even reach Antwerp before running dry. Despite these realities, Hitler pressed on. His generals expressed doubts. Men like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Hasso von Manteuffel warned that the plan was too ambitious, too risky, and that Germany lacked the resources for such a bold thrust. They argued instead for a smaller, limited strike to weaken the Allies and delay their advance. But Hitler would not hear of it. He demanded nothing less than a decisive victory. The Ardennes was chosen not only for its geography, but also for the complacency of the Allies. The region was heavily wooded, with steep hills, narrow valleys, and poor roads that were easily clogged by snow and ice. Allied commanders considered it an unlikely location for a major offensive. As a result, the sector was lightly defended, held mostly by units recovering from earlier battles or by inexperienced troops new to the front. The U.S. First Army, responsible for the Ardennes, treated the area as a rest sector rather than a front-line danger zone. This miscalculation played directly into German hands. Overconfidence, faulty intelligence, and the distraction of Allied offensive operations elsewhere left the Ardennes vulnerable. To make matters worse, the weather in December was dreadful. Heavy clouds and snow grounded the Allied air forces, the most powerful advantage the Western Allies possessed. Hitler understood this. If his troops struck while the skies remained overcast, they could advance without fear of devastating air attacks. In total, the Germans assembled over 400,000 men, more than 1,400 tanks and armored vehicles, and 2,600 artillery pieces for the assault. The scale was staggering, especially given the depleted state of the Reich. To disguise these movements, strict secrecy was enforced. Orders were handwritten rather than transmitted by radio. Troop movements took place at night or under the cover of poor weather. Civilian traffic was banned in the build-up zones. Even many German soldiers themselves had no idea what the true objective was until just before the attack began. The Allies, for their part, were distracted. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was planning future offensives into Germany. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group was focused on reaching the Rhine, and British Field Marshal Montgomery in the north was preparing his own advance. Few seriously believed the Germans were capable of a major counterattack. All of this set the stage for what was to come. The Germans were about to unleash one of the most audacious offensives of the Second World War. Their goal was nothing less than to break the Allied line wide open. For the men holding the Ardennes, most of whom expected a quiet winter, the reality would soon be terrifyingly different. The pieces were in place. The troops were ready, the orders had been given, and at dawn on December 16th, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes would be shattered. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, 1944, the quiet of the Ardennes forest was shattered. The first artillery shells screamed through the pre-dawn darkness, striking with terrifying precision. Over 1,600 German guns opened fire simultaneously, sending shock waves through the frost-covered hills. Trees splintered, buildings shook, and the earth itself seemed to roar. For the American troops stationed in the Ardennes, the experience was terrifying and bewildering. Most had been stationed in this sector for weeks, believing it to be quiet, a place to rest and recover. Many were inexperienced replacements, barely acclimated to the harsh realities of frontline combat. Now they faced the full fury of a German offensive, unlike anything they had encountered. The first wave of German tanks rolled forward through the dense forest. Panzer IVs, Panthers, and the fearsome Tiger tanks rumbled down icy roads, their engines growling, their tracks leaving deep grooves in the snow. Infantry followed closely behind, moving with deadly coordination, using the terrain to mask their advance. Some units even wore captured American uniforms and carried false documents to sow confusion behind the lines. Part of Operation Greif, Otto Skorzeny's daring sabotage campaign. American units were caught off guard. Communications lines were severed by artillery, radios jammed, and commanders struggled to assess the rapidly changing situation. Soldiers in foxholes were suddenly exposed to the deafening roar of tanks, the whistling of incoming shells, and the cries of wounded comrades. Panic spread, but so did determination. Many units, despite being inexperienced and under-equipped, fought fiercely to slow the German advance. The weather compounded the chaos. thick, overcast skies grounded the Allied air forces, removing a major advantage that could have helped halt the German attack. Pilots who could normally strike with devastating precision were now confined to bases, forced to watch from afar as the Wehrmacht pushed forward. Visibility on the ground was poor, snow and fog hiding enemy movements and making every decision a gamble with life or death consequences. In towns across the Ardennes, civilians awoke to the sound of artillery and the sight of armored columns advancing through streets and past homes. Families fled into the forests, clutching children and valuables, while others hid in cellars as the battle rolled through. The psychological toll of this sudden, overwhelming assault was immense, adding another layer of fear and confusion to the already chaotic battlefield. The German plan relied on speed and coordination. They aimed to capture key crossroads and towns, severing Allied lines of communication and preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. The advance was methodical. Armored spearheads broke through thinly held positions, while mechanized infantry followed closely to consolidate gains. But even in these early hours, cracks began to appear. The Ardennes terrain, with its narrow roads, steep ridges, and dense forests, slowed the movement of tanks and convoys. Roads became clogged, and supply units struggled to keep up with the rapidly advancing spearheads. Despite these challenges, the Germans achieved near total surprise. Many American commanders were still attempting to understand the scope of the attack when their units were already engaged in life-or-death battles. Small skirmishes erupted into larger engagements, towns changed hands, and units were cut off from their supply lines. Every hour brought new tension and danger as the American defenders scrambled to regroup and resist the offensive. Stories from the front reveal the intensity of those first hours. In one instance, an American platoon, hearing the sound of approaching tanks, attempted to set up an ambush along a narrow road. Their anti-tank weapons managed to destroy several enemy vehicles, but the remaining panzers pressed on, forcing the Americans to retreat under heavy fire. Elsewhere, small groups of soldiers held villages for hours against overwhelming odds, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. By the end of the first day, the Germans had penetrated deep into American lines, creating a pronounced bulge, the feature that would give the battle its name. The scale of the advance was staggering, and yet the resistance, scattered and uncoordinated as it was, hinted at the determination that would define the American response in the coming weeks. The stage was set for a winter battle unlike any other. Men would fight in sub-zero temperatures, with snow and ice covering the ground, and freezing artillery and vehicles alike. The forests of the Ardennes, which had seemed a quiet backwater to the Allies, had become the epicenter of a conflict that would test courage, endurance, and the limits of human resilience. And in the midst of the chaos, both sides would soon realize that this battle was more than a clash of armies. It was a desperate struggle for survival, for honor, and for the fate of the Western Front itself. In the days immediately following the opening bombardment on December 16th, the German offensive seemed unstoppable. American troops were caught off guard, their units scattered, communications in disarray, and reinforcements miles away. Entire regiments, many of them composed of inexperienced replacements, barely trained for front-line combat, were surrounded or forced to surrender. The Germans advanced with terrifying efficiency. Tanks rumbled down narrow forest roads, infantry swept through villages, and mechanized units moved quickly to secure critical crossroads. Commanders on both sides struggled to assess the situation. The American front was bending, and in some sectors it seemed ready to snap entirely under the relentless pressure. Part of the German success was psychological. Special forces disguised in American uniforms infiltrated rear areas, spreading confusion and fear. Otto Skorzeny's operation, codenamed Operation Greif, saw German soldiers posing as Americans on bicycles, in jeeps, or marching through towns to mislead troops and divert Allied forces. Roads became jammed with misdirected traffic, and checkpoints required troops to prove their identity under scrutiny. Stories abound of soldiers being questioned on trivial knowledge, such as the rules of baseball or local geography, to prove they were truly American. The effects on morale were profound. Units that had been confident only days before now felt exposed and vulnerable. In many cases, soldiers were forced to fight in fragmented groups with no clear orders or support. Officers improvised defensive lines wherever they could, barricading streets and setting up anti-tank positions in houses, barns, and woodlands. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures compounded the challenges. Men struggled not only with enemy fire, but also with frostbite, exhaustion, and the physical limits of survival in sub-zero weather. In towns throughout the Ardennes, civilians were caught in the crossfire. Families fled their homes in the dead of night, carrying what possessions they could manage, while others huddled in cellars as artillery and tanks swept through their streets. The chaos created not only material destruction, but also a psychological trauma that would linger long after the battle ended. Despite the initial chaos, American resistance emerged in key locations. Small groups of soldiers mounted desperate defenses, delaying German advances in villages and along roads. Anti-tank teams, using bazookas and artillery, managed to destroy or disable some German vehicles. These small victories, often won at great cost, bought critical time for the Allies to reorganize and reinforce vulnerable sectors. The Ardennes terrain, which the Germans had hoped would allow rapid armored advances, also began to work against them. Narrow roads clogged with vehicles, snow-covered forests, and steep ridges slowed the armored columns, forcing the Germans to advance in single-file formations, vulnerable to ambush. Supply convoys lagged behind the front lines, causing shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food for the advancing units. Even so, by December 18th, the Germans had achieved impressive gains. The bulge in the Allied lines was clearly visible on maps, and towns that had been considered secure were now in enemy hands. The scale of the advance, combined with the confusion among the American troops, created an impression that the Wehrmacht might succeed in cutting the Allied armies in two. However, beneath the veneer of German success, cracks were forming. Logistics problems, worsening winter conditions, and stubborn pockets of resistance slowed the advance. American troops, despite being inexperienced, were learning quickly, improvising defenses, and communicating where possible to coordinate counteractions. At the same time, news of the offensive began to reach higher Allied command. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower and Omar Bradley realized the scale of the attack and began to mobilize reinforcements. While the initial shock favored the Germans, the Allies were preparing to strike back with everything they had. The early success of the German offensive, though impressive, came at a high cost. Units were exhausted, fuel reserves dwindled, and armored vehicles suffered mechanical breakdowns in the cold. These factors, combined with the growing determination of American defenders, would soon begin to halt the German advance. The first days of the Battle of the Bulge, therefore, were a study in contrasts, the seemingly unstoppable power of a well-planned offensive versus the resilience and improvisation of troops caught in crisis. While the Wehrmacht had created panic and disorder, the seeds of resistance were already being sown. A resistance that would define the coming weeks of one of the most brutal battles of World War II. Bastogne, a small town in southern Belgium, suddenly became the epicenter of one of the most dramatic episodes of the Battle of the Bulge. Its location was critical, a crossroads of 7 major roads, controlling the movement of troops and supplies through the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne could dominate the surrounding region, and the Germans knew it. Capturing it was essential to the success of their offensive. The defenders of Bastogne were outnumbered and under-equipped. The 101st Airborne Division, recently deployed to the area, was joined by elements of the 10th Armored Division and other units pulled from the surrounding sectors. Many of the soldiers were tired, cold, and inexperienced, having faced only minor skirmishes before being thrown into the frigid Ardennes winter. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, and snow and ice made movement difficult, sapping strength and morale. Despite these challenges, the Americans prepared to hold the town at all costs. Defensive positions were established in houses, barns, and cellars, with streets barricaded to slow the German advance. Artillery units improvised firing positions wherever they could, and supply officers rationed ammunition, food, and medical resources carefully. The townspeople, many of whom were caught in the chaos, helped where they could, providing shelter, information, and sometimes risking their lives to assist the defenders. The Germans quickly encircled Bastogne, surrounding the town and cutting off supply lines. Snow-covered roads made relief efforts difficult, and the encircled soldiers faced the possibility of starvation, exposure, and annihilation. Yet morale, remarkably, remained high. Letters and diaries from the defenders speak of a grim determination, an unspoken pact to hold the crossroads no matter the cost. On December 22nd, the Germans sent envoys under a white flag to deliver an ultimatum: surrender the town or face total destruction. The response of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne, became legendary. When asked for a reply, he simply wrote one word: nuts, a dismissive, almost incredulous refusal. The story of McAuliffe's reply spread rapidly among the defenders and would later become a symbol of American tenacity. Soldiers found renewed courage in the audacity of that single word, repeating it as a mantra in the trenches and snowbound streets of Bastogne. It was not only a defiance of the enemy, but a declaration of resolve, a refusal to be cowed, even under the harshest conditions. Throughout the siege, the fighting was relentless. German artillery shelled the town continuously, while infantry and armored units probed for weaknesses. American snipers and anti-tank teams inflicted damage where they could, turning the town into a deadly maze for the attackers. Small pockets of resistance, sometimes no larger than a platoon, slowed German movements and disrupted their supply lines. Every hour of resistance forced the Germans to adjust their plans, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. The weather played a dual role in the battle. While heavy snow and overcast skies initially helped the Germans achieve surprise, they also slowed their own movement and created logistical nightmares. For the Americans trapped inside Bastogne, the snow was both a hindrance and a protective cover, limiting German visibility and reducing the effectiveness of attacks. Still, the extreme cold exacted a heavy toll. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exposure claimed as many victims as the fighting itself. Medical staff worked tirelessly under near-impossible conditions, improvising care and treating the wounded in freezing cellars and abandoned buildings. Meanwhile, outside the town, General George S. Patton and the Third Army were executing a daring maneuver to relieve the siege. Moving through snow, ice, and treacherous terrain, Patton's forces advanced rapidly, racing against both time and the German encirclement. Soldiers trudged through knee-deep snow, sometimes improvising roads to move tanks and artillery forward, all while under threat of German counterattacks. By December 26th, Patton's lead elements reached Bastogne. The encirclement was broken, reinforcements brought supplies, and the German attempt to seize the crossroads had failed. The siege had lasted nearly a week, a grueling test of endurance, courage, and human spirit. Soldiers who survived described the relief as almost indescribable, a sense of vindication, survival, and the knowledge that their defiance had altered the course of the battle. The Siege of Bastogne would become one of the most iconic episodes of World War II. It demonstrated how determination, improvisation, and sheer human courage could turn the tide in the face of overwhelming odds. It also marked the beginning of the end for the German offensive in the Ardennes, setting the stage for the Allied counterattack that would reclaim lost territory and push the Wehrmacht back toward Germany. As December progressed, the German advance showed signs of strain. Despite the initial successes, logistical challenges, harsh winter conditions, and stubborn pockets of American resistance slowed their momentum. Roads clogged with tanks, supply trucks, and frozen vehicles created bottlenecks. Fuel shortages became critical, leaving some German armored units stranded and vulnerable. Meanwhile, the defenders of key towns like Bastogne refused to yield. On December 23rd, the skies finally cleared over the Ardennes. After days of heavy cloud cover, the Allied air forces were able to take to the skies once again. This marked a dramatic shift in the battle. Long-range bombers and fighter bombers roamed the snow-covered forests, targeting German columns, supply depots, and artillery positions. Tanks that had previously advanced unhindered were now vulnerable to strafing runs and precise bombing. Roads clogged with immobilized vehicles became death traps. The Luftwaffe, already weakened, struggled to contest air superiority, leaving German ground forces exposed. At the same time, General George S. Patton executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of World War II. Patton's Third Army, initially positioned south of the Ardennes, had been ordered to pivot northward to relieve Bastogne. The operation required extraordinary speed, coordination, and endurance. Troops marched through freezing snow and ice, improvising roads where necessary to move artillery and tanks, all while braving treacherous winter terrain. Patton's forces encountered pockets of resistance along the way, but their advance was relentless. Cavalry and armored reconnaissance units scouted routes, engineers cleared obstacles, and infantry pushed through blizzard-like conditions to maintain momentum. By December 26th, elements of the Third Army reached the outskirts of Bastogne, breaking the German siege and delivering desperately needed supplies and reinforcements to the encircled defenders. This relief marked the turning point in the Ardennes offensive. German units, which had counted on rapid victories and decisive momentum, found themselves trapped in a logistical nightmare. Fuel shortages, harsh terrain, and now the threat of air attacks slowed their advance to a crawl. Attempts to bypass or encircle Allied positions were thwarted by determined resistance and timely counterattacks. The psychological impact was significant. For the American troops, the arrival of Patton's forces brought renewed hope and determination. Soldiers who had endured days of relentless attacks, freezing temperatures, and dwindling supplies now knew relief was on the way. For German commanders, the dream of splitting the Allied armies and seizing Antwerp began to fade. Every delay compounded the logistical strain, and morale began to deteriorate as the realization set in that victory was slipping from reach. Outside Bastogne, Allied forces also coordinated attacks to push German forces back from other key positions. British units under Field Marshal Montgomery advanced in the north, while American divisions launched counteroffensives along the southern and central flanks. Slowly but surely, the bulge in the lines began to shrink. The Germans, despite their initial brilliance and audacity, could not maintain the pace needed to achieve their strategic objectives. At the same time, the human element remained critical. Soldiers endured bitter cold, frostbite, and exhaustion, yet they continued to fight with tenacity. Engineers worked to clear roads blocked by wrecked vehicles, medics treated the wounded under fire, and officers coordinated defensive lines despite communication breakdowns. Small acts of bravery and improvisation, repeated across the Ardennes, collectively helped turn the tide. By the end of December, the turning point was undeniable. The Allies had regained the initiative, the German advance was slowing to a halt, and the hope of capturing Antwerp had vanished. The Battle of the Bulge, which had begun as a stunning demonstration of German tactical skill and surprise, was now shifting toward attrition, a slow squeeze that would eventually force the enemy into retreat. The skies, once a barrier to the Allies, now symbolized their strength. Air power combined with ground maneuvers to choke the German advance, marking a decisive shift in the balance of the battle. From this point forward, momentum was no longer with the attackers, but with the defenders. with soldiers determined to reclaim lost ground and ensure that Hitler's last gamble would fail. With the siege of Bastogne lifted and Allied air power restored, the stage was set for a full-scale counterattack. The Allies, now fully mobilized and coordinated, began a deliberate push to reclaim the territory lost in the initial German advance. What had begun as a shocking offensive by the Wehrmacht was gradually being transformed into a war of attrition, one where determination, coordination, and sheer resources would decide the outcome. Patton's Third Army spearheaded the southern counteroffensive, pushing northward through snow-choked roads and forested terrain. Infantry units advanced alongside tanks and artillery, clearing villages and roadblocks while engaging scattered German units. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair destroyed bridges and clear debris, allowing armored units to maintain their momentum. The pace of the advance was relentless, as commanders knew that every day of delay gave the Germans precious time to regroup. To the north, British forces under Field Marshal Montgomery coordinated attacks along the Ardennes' northern flank. This pressure forced German units to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, stretching their already thin lines to the breaking point. American divisions in the central sector also launched counterattacks, gradually squeezing the Bulge and reclaiming key towns. Roads once dominated by German columns now saw advancing Allied vehicles, supported by airstrikes that targeted retreating units and supply depots. The German forces, despite their initial brilliance and audacity, were facing mounting problems. Fuel shortages, freezing temperatures, and damaged vehicles left many armored units immobilized. Logistics could not keep pace with their sprawling front, and reinforcements were delayed or non-existent. Morale, already shaken by the failure to capture Bastogne, began to crumble under relentless Allied pressure. Desperate attempts to regain initiative were increasingly futile. German tanks and infantry were forced into defensive positions, often fighting for mere yards of snow-covered terrain. Ambitious flanking maneuvers and counterattacks were repelled by determined American and British soldiers, who had learned quickly to exploit every weakness in the enemy's lines. Soldiers on both sides endured bitter cold, frostbite, and exhaustion. But Allied troops benefited from better supply lines and reinforcements that the Germans simply could not replace. In towns like Fort Notre Dame, the farthest point reached by the German advance, American forces finally halted the attackers. Fierce fighting raged in villages, forests, and crossroads, with artillery and small arms fire echoing through snow-laden streets. Despite heavy casualties, the Americans pressed forward, driving the Germans back step by step. Every retaken village, every cleared road, marked a symbolic and strategic victory, bolstering morale across the Allied front. The Allied counterattack was not simply a military maneuver, it was also a psychological one. Soldiers who had endured days of intense pressure and fear now regained a sense of purpose and confidence. Units that had been pinned down, isolated, or encircled began coordinating with neighboring formations, reclaiming the initiative. Air power, now fully operational, struck at German columns retreating under pressure, further amplifying the effect of the ground offensive. By early January, the bulge in the lines had begun to shrink dramatically. German forces were increasingly on the defensive, unable to sustain their initial gains or mount any meaningful new offensives. The Wehrmacht, once confident of a decisive victory, now faced the reality of retreat. Supplies were exhausted, armored vehicles were destroyed or abandoned, and many soldiers had suffered frostbite or injuries that left them unable to fight. The counterattack showcased the coordination and adaptability of the Allied forces. American and British units worked together across sectors, combining mechanized forces, artillery, and infantry assaults with air support. Logistics, communications, and planning proved decisive, allowing the Allies to methodically restore the front line to its pre-offensive positions. By the end of the month, the German offensive had been effectively broken. While isolated fighting continued into late January, the momentum had decisively shifted. The Allies had regained the territory lost in the Ardennes, inflicted severe casualties on the German forces, and demonstrated the limits of Hitler's final gamble on the Western Front. The counterattack not only recovered ground, but also shattered the remnants of Germany's armored reserves, leaving the Wehrmacht increasingly incapable of mounting another major offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge, which raged from December 16th, 1944, to January 25th, 1945, had come to an end. What began as a bold German gamble ended in failure, leaving a trail of devastation and human suffering in its wake. Both sides suffered enormous casualties. German forces lost between 63,000 and 104,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, and suffered devastating losses in tanks, armored vehicles, and aircraft. The depletion of experienced units would have long-term consequences, leaving the Wehrmacht increasingly incapable of mounting another major offensive on the Western Front. Allied casualties were also heavy, with more than 77,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, including over 8,600 Americans. The cold, snow, and harsh winter conditions contributed significantly to these numbers. Frostbite, exposure, and illness claimed as many victims as bullets and shells. Civilians in the Ardennes region endured the chaos of combat, displacement, and the destruction of homes and towns, adding a lasting human cost to the strategic calculations of the battle. Strategically, the Battle of the Bulge marked a turning point. For Germany, it was the last major offensive on the Western Front. The failure of the Ardennes offensive meant that the initiative permanently shifted to the Allies. Germany's armored forces, severely depleted, could no longer conduct large-scale attacks, leaving the remaining months of the war increasingly defensive. The Luftwaffe, already weakened, suffered further losses, allowing the Allies to dominate the skies for the final push into Germany. For the Allies, the battle reinforced the importance of coordination, logistics, and adaptability. Rapid reinforcement, combined arms operations, and the effective use of air power proved decisive. The resilience of American troops, particularly in places like Bastogne, became legendary, highlighting the combination of courage, improvisation, and tenacity that characterized the Allied response. The legacy of the Battle of the Bulge extends beyond tactics and strategy. It became a symbol of endurance, illustrating how determination and leadership could withstand even the most brutal assaults. Stories of bravery, like the defiance at Bastogne and the improvisation of small units holding critical positions, were passed down through letters, memoirs, and historical accounts. These narratives became a testament to human courage under extreme adversity. The battle also provided valuable lessons for military planning. Intelligence failures, overconfidence, and the misjudgment of enemy capabilities were all highlighted as factors that allowed Germany to achieve surprise initially. Allied forces learned to better integrate reconnaissance, prepare for winter combat, and coordinate across multinational armies. These lessons would be applied in the final push across Germany in the months to follow. Historically, the Battle of the Bulge is remembered as one of the largest and bloodiest battles fought by the United States during World War II. It tested the limits of soldiers on both sides, combining harsh environmental conditions with intense combat. The human cost, the heroism displayed, and the strategic consequences make it one of the defining moments of the Western Front. In the end, the failure of Hitler's last gamble accelerated the collapse of Nazi Germany. German forces were forced to retreat to the Siegfried Line, their reserves depleted, their morale shattered. The Allies, meanwhile, regained the initiative and continued their advance toward the Rhine, setting the stage for the final battles of the European theater. The Ardennes, once a quiet, forested region of Belgium and Luxembourg, had become a crucible of endurance, courage, and strategy. The snow-covered hills, frozen forests, and narrow roads bore witness to a struggle that tested every soldier, every leader, and every strategy. And long after the guns fell silent, the Battle of the Bulge remained a stark reminder. Even in the face of surprise, adversity, and overwhelming odds, human determination could turn the tide and shape the course of history.